All right, if you would, let's open up our Bibles to the book of Esther. We are going to be starting Esther this week. We'll see if we can get through a couple of chapters. See if I can find mine here. Should have had it marked. Would have been smart. Esther is a very unique book in Scripture. As I look at it now, I don't know if my wording up here is big enough for everybody in the back to see. But if there's one theme in Esther, it's the providence of God. In fact, if you look at Esther 4, verse 14, it is one verse that kind of summarizes the entire book for those of us who also believe in God. Esther 4:14 says, "For if you keep silent at this time," this is Mordecai talking to Esther, when he's challenging her to go stand up, to go put herself at risk, to save God's people. "If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews for another place." God still has a plan, and nothing we can do can intervene with that. "But you and your father's house will perish because you're not the one who chooses to do so." And then he finishes by saying, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Wow, that's kind of powerful. We live in a godless nation now that was founded upon godly principles, but it no longer has those principles throughout. There's a basis there, but we can all see. In fact, we were just talking about it this morning, how far our world has changed just in the last 30 or 40 years. But it wasn't nearly as godless as this world that Esther was born into. And there's so many things that we can learn from this particular book in the Bible, but it has so many unique features. Some people have said, well, God's not directly mentioned in Esther. Indirectly, sure. But not like a lot of other scriptures where God speaks and his people listen. That's one unique thing about it. It's a woman in a very prominent role. Well, that speaks to things that we deal with today. There are people out there who will say, and I've heard them say it, "Oh, if you're a Christian, you believe in the subjugation of women. That women have no role to play, no honor, they are pushed down upon." And here we have, in circa 400 some odd BC, a woman who's risen to one of the highest levels of one of the most dominant empires that the world has known, and has the ability to go directly to the leader of that country, or that empire, I guess I should say, and affect decisions going forward. And that was God's choice. And God enacted that. Before I go too much farther, let's go through some of the history. And I'm going to say, because I was in here for some of Corey's lessons, I thought he did an excellent job going through some of the possible kings and the levels of everything that was done. It can be difficult. And there are some disagreements. But in the book of Esther, as we have it written, Ahasuerus is the king. I don't even know how to say that. Ahasuerus, however you say it, is the king that is listed. The difficulty is Ahasuerus is listed multiple times throughout the Bible, and it appears that multiple different kings are also referenced. So there's some debate about who this is. Most believe that the Ahasuerus that we have in the book of Esther is Xerxes the First, or Xerxes I, who is the son of Darius the Great, or Darius the Great, depending upon how you like to say it. The time frame, it's in the captivity. It's the Persian Empire, which overthrew the Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire. And it's probably around 475 BC, give or take a little bit. Again, I don't know that that's essential, but it does help kind of set where we're at and what's going on. In terms of what we've been going through in here between Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding and the trips back to Jerusalem to recreate Jerusalem prior to Christ's coming a few hundred years later, this is probably anywhere from 30 to 50 years after those events. A lot of those events would have occurred in the early 500 BC time period, and we're now in the 400s, remembering that BC we're counting down to 0. And I refuse to say BCE, it's BC. So there's the time frame of it. God's people are still scattered. Here we have Mordecai, who we'll see, as we'll read in just a little bit. Mordecai, one of the central players, is an official in this kingdom in Persia. It seems to be set primarily in Susa, or Shusha, which was not the actual capital, but was kind of, from what I read, a secondary home away from home, so to speak, for the kings, where they had a fortress and a place. But it was a prominent city in this time period. Also, we have the events of all the scatterings of the Jewish peoples. You have then Esther, who's not only a Jewish young woman, she's an orphan. I mean, I have been blessed in my time working for Forward Christian to take high school students to Peru. We've gone to Cusco, Peru, which was the capital, ancient capital of the Incan Empire. But now it's just a relatively large city in the country of Peru. And we've worked with an orphanage there, a Christian orphanage, that because they're Christian, they don't get state funds. When you see orphans in countries like that, and it's not even a second or third world country, it gives you an understanding of what that must be like. Just the absolute deprivation of young children that have nothing. But Mordecai, you can see what type of man he is by just bringing Esther into his home. And we don't have any understanding about really the rest of Mordecai's family. We don't know all the inner workings. There's no wife mentioned. There's no other family members mentioned. But it appears that Mordecai brought Esther into his home and trained her as he would his own daughter. Greater religion has no one than this, that one should care for widows and orphans in their distress. I think that's a wonderful thing that we as believers in God should always focus on, that we care for those who need help. But let's pause in all of the background and the like. Let's read a little bit of the book. I'm going to paraphrase from the first part of the chapter. We're not going to start reading until verse 10, but Ahasuerus, probably Xerxes the first, takes over from his father. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he has a feast that is to last 180 days. Now, how many months is that? I teach math. 180 divided by 30, 6 months. I have never, ever known of a party to last 6 months. Nor do I ever want to attend said party. And it's early in his reign. He's trying to cement his rule, his power. History, if it is Xerxes, doesn't have a lot of great things to say about him. Darius, his father, was the one who kind of conquered Xerxes came in and just was not well thought of in a lot of ways. But 180 days. This is the height of the world. I mean, there's talk here about how the king says, apparently, usually at this time, the only time you got to drink of alcohol or other things in these feasts was whenever the king would drink. He sets that aside and he says, you drink freely. And so you have all these people just carousing, putting caution to the wind, drinking, drunkenness, revelries, all of the kind of stuff. And does sin always follow such actions? Yes. There's a reason God says, no, drunkenness needs to be put aside. It's not something that we can do. We need to be sober-minded. I read one historical article. I don't know the veracity of it, but it even said that there was a saying about the Persian Empire by Herodotus, who was an old historian, Greek historian, that they would make a lot of their decisions when drunk intentionally, but then they would go back afterwards when sober and look at it again and decide how to put it into law. You talk about a society that's just crazy. And you add to that society, when it enacts a law, are they allowed to revoke the law? No. And we see that here in the book of Esther as well. So just some chaos. And this is where God's people are found. At the end of the 180 days, he has a final 7-day feast with his closest advisors. They all get drunk, and on the very final day, the 7th day, he decides that he's going to bring his wife, Queen Vashti, in before his counselors. And that's where we're going to pick up reading in verse 10, if you would, with me. Verse 10 of chapter 1. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. We don't know all the backstory here. There is a lot of supposition. I looked at, honestly, a bunch of Jewish folk tales and historical references to this event. And according to, basically, you would say, old wives' tales among the Jewish women, Queen Vashti herself, which this may or may not be true, was very repressive against Jewish women and would force them to dance naked at events on the Sabbath, intentionally to put a conflict in them. Now, again, I have absolutely no way of knowing if this is true or not. This is what Jewish history teaches about this historical time period. It's ironic. That also goes into further, they look at Queen Vashti being told to attend with her crown, and the tale goes that it was only her crown. So she was supposed to appear in front of all these drunk men, naked, wearing only her crown. Again, we don't know this for sure. But I can tell you, even if that's not the case, can you imagine a husband asking his wife simply to show her off for her beauty to a bunch of drunk men at a party that have been drinking for 180 plus days? Whatever the reasoning is, whether this was some form of a judgment against Vashti for mistreating Jewish women, or simply her being fearful of the results of showing up, she says no. And the king and his counselors get together, and of course they decide, well, this is disrespectful. Well, remember how we started off by saying that anytime you get a bunch of drunk people together, sin will occur. This is the kind of man that Esther was forced to marry. What say did Esther really get in any of this? Not much. And the main thing she knows about this man, perhaps, when she first hears of the call for all the young, beautiful women of the kingdom to be brought in, to be tested to see if they're able to be the king's new queen, is that the old queen was commanded to appear and entertain in whatever capacity other men while drunk. That puts a new light on what Esther did, I think, in a lot of ways. He continues on. They send out an edict that how dare Queen Vashti not appear. And again, we don't know exactly for what reason. And fearing that other women would take up the mantle of Vashti and refuse to obey their husbands, they send out an edict. Now, what we don't know is exactly what happened to Vashti. There's a bunch of different beliefs as to what eventually happened to her. It's possible she was executed. It's possible she was forced into exile. We really don't know. But she's put aside. And they decide that they're going to have a new queen that's chosen. That is going to be a big deal, and it takes a long time. This takes over a year, and it's even more sordid than you might think. When the king sends out this edict for all these young women to come in, they're all given into the hands of this one eunuch. At this time, usually the eunuchs would be responsible for guarding and caring for much of the king's wives, harem, the like. Keep in mind that even King Solomon had over 700 wives and concubines. Well, here's a Persian king that probably has hundreds of wives and concubines and the like also. And so they would have these eunuchs guard over them. And we're going to read about Esther's being thrown into this situation. Now, at this point, we have no idea. If you're reading it contemporary, you have no idea what's to come. But as we look at it as Christians, we can see the hand of God throughout in hindsight. That happens here. And we don't know how God is working right now, but at this very moment, God is putting into place His people, His chosen people, to do the things that He needs them to do at the right time to preserve His people. What that is, we don't know. Do we as Christians get to know what God's plan is? No, we don't see all things. We don't know all things. Do we have to, in faith, move forward with a decision that no matter what it is that we're called to do, we need to step up at the right time and do God's will? It doesn't matter if we live in a kingdom like this with a king, where one of us could be put forward as a queen, or if we live in a nation like today. I look at Esther, and Esther tells me that as Christians, if God puts you in a position to lead a company, you go lead a company and you do it in a Christian way that serves God's will. If God puts you in the position to be a leader of a local county office, you go be that political leader, but you do it in a way that serves God. If God puts you in a position to be raised up to the highest levels of civilian authority or even military authority in our land, then go be a Christian leader, politician, senator, congressperson, general, you name it. The reason I am saying that in this way is I've heard other Christians say, no, God doesn't want us to be in those roles. Those are secular roles. Queen Vashti was in a secular role that saved God's people. And we don't know where we are called to be. Others of us, I'm just a high school teacher. How do I know that the words that I say to one of these young men or women that I have to deal with is not going to spur them on to something that God needs them to do? Others of you have other areas of influence We need to pray to God that we recognize what our influence is and how we should use it to serve His kingdom. Because we're not going to always know what it's going to lead to, but God has a plan in place for such a time as this. Let's continue into chapter 2. Any thoughts or comments before we move into chapter 2? Speak up if needed. It's sometimes hard from here in this perspective, seeing hands, so just let me know. Chapter 2, let's actually start at verse 1. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So Mordecai was likely carried away, perhaps even the same time that Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Mishael, the Jewish names, all those, Azariah. Also Daniel, the great prophet and leader in later times. Daniel is kind of a contemporary in some ways of all of these goings on. I did not study which kings directly Daniel served, but if you'll remember, Daniel served multiple kings over a lifespan that I think was 80s, 90s, and even spanned multiple empires. What a wonderful, godly man Daniel was. And so this is near that time frame. Verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Esther is her Persian name. Hadassah is her Jewish name. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Excuse me. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So all of a sudden, we don't know a lot about Esther, but apparently her character is such that among all of these women, probably hundreds of women, she becomes the favorite of this eunuch who's in charge of all of them. Probably speaks highly of her. We don't know exactly the circumstances here, but you can see God's plan already started. Greg, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just saying, her demeanor put her above everybody else. And that's Christians, that's what we need. We need to show Christ through our actions in the world.
Well, and we can take it even farther. There are other indications in Scripture, I can't remember exactly where it is, that it talks about Mordecai asking her to do certain things, and she does it. And she submits to a man who's not, think about what we see among children that go through difficult circumstances. Many times, those children can be difficult if it's not a traditional mother and father situation. They can use that to get what they want at times. She doesn't do it. Mordecai, she is the daughter of Mordecai's uncle, so it sounds kind of like they're cousins here. Mordecai just must be an older cousin, brings her in and cares for her as a daughter. And she treats him respectfully like a father. All the other things aside, God's people can accomplish great things with courage, kindness, and submission to authority. Now, are there limits when God will say, submit to me, not to authorities? Certainly. But we don't need to be brash and loud. We don't need to be on street corners for God's message to be heard. We do need to be in people's homes. We need to be in our friends' lives. We need to be in the lives of those who are not believers. And we need to be courageous enough to kindly and respectfully speak to them about the way God would want us to do things. And perhaps that's what we're seeing here with Esther. Let's skip down to verse 10. Key point. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. There are some writings of Jewish historians and Herodotus, who's a Greek historian, that there was a purge even at this time against the Israelites, the Jewish people. They were, much as we hear today, with everything that happened in World War II and the Nazi camps, they were attacked and trodden upon, so to speak. So she probably went by the name Esther, her Persian name. Skip down to verse 12. Now when the turn came from each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So please understand, at this point, Esther is a slave. Esther is a concubine. When they said, bring in all these beautiful young virgins, probably somewhere between the ages of 14 and 18. You need to understand, at this time, women probably around the age of 16 were often involved in this. And then they're called in to go to the king for the night. I think you all know what that means. This is not something where they had a beautiful dinner together and decided slowly whether they were compatible and everything else. The king demanded. Esther, the slave, obeyed. She went and had to please him, and probably in ways that we know is not appropriate for the people of God. She had no choice in the matter. Do you see her screaming at the horrible unfairness of this? No, but probably inside she was. She had no say. And let me say this, God was still in charge. God was still in control. God was still enacting his plan, even though his beautiful young daughter, who he created, Esther, was a slave to a godless man who would use her and abuse her for his own purposes. We don't deal with that, and God is still in control. But as we see the sin of the world creeping in perhaps a little bit, we need to understand God is still in control. That does not mean that God will step in and will take away every hurt, will provide or enact justice in this world. That is for the next world. But God's child here continued in faith, moving forward through difficulties, did not harden her heart, did not get bitter, that we can tell, And when the time came about for God to ask her, here's my plan for you, she stepped up and she did it. That's powerful. That is really powerful as an example to us. There's a lot of stuff that I've been through. I haven't been through that. And thank God I probably won't have to. Can I still step up and serve when God says, I need you to be courageous and I need you to stand up and protect my children, my people, my word, my truth, the truth? I think so. And we need to prepare ourselves for it, just as Esther was being prepared here. Esther goes in, pleases him, and gets chosen out of all these other women. Now again, behind the scenes, we have this Haggai who's favoring her, who's probably setting her up in the most favorable position, who probably has the ear of the king saying, you need to look at Esther. This is a great young woman. And even though God allows free will to reign, God enacts his will here. And Esther's chosen. And God knows what she's going through, and God's going to protect and provide for her. But it's not going to be always easy. And then look down at verse 19. And let's finish with this, because then all of a sudden we're thrown in. Total side note in the story. It's one of the things that when I was young, I remember I had one of those illustrated Bible sets of books, and they would go through a lot of the books. My favorite one was Esther, because it's like a ready for TV made movie right here. It's got all the subplots and everything else. It's kind of exciting. And so here we go. Verse 19 of chapter 2. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. There again is this quality that she has. In spite of her circumstances, she kept her heart soft to God, to acting right, to doing good things. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Rather than sit there and be like, oh, that's bad, look at Mordecai also. Here is a king who he's subject to, which in many ways could be considered to be abusing his adopted daughter with the way that he treats these women. But he does the right thing. He goes and he uses his relationship with Esther and her relationship with the king and says, you need to know about this. You need to know there's a plot against the king. Verse 22, and this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. So not only did Esther tell the king, did Esther try to take credit for it? No, she said, King Ahasuerus, I need you to know what your servant Mordecai has told me. There's a plot against your life. And God's will continues to be unfolded. Because now God has set up a queen who serves him in the palace of the king. Well, look at Daniel. What did God do with Daniel throughout multiple kingdoms and multiple empires? He put his most trusted servant Daniel right in his ear. I don't know if it applies today, but I found this very interesting years ago. When President Trump was in office, I read an article that said that the grandfather of the Duck Dynasty clan. All I know is he's an elder in the West Monroe Church of Christ. I don't know that much more other than what we see on TV. But we have an elder in the Lord's church. He went into the then President Trump 3 occasions. He was asked by a reporter, what do y'all talk about when you're in there? He very succinctly replied, all we're doing is talking about the Bible. Will God always put his people where he needs them, when he needs them to do his will? I think so. And so now Mordecai is being told to the king, hey, there's this great servant of yours, Mordecai, he's protecting you. Esther's there, giving the knowledge, protecting, and all of this stuff is setting up what will unfold later. Do any of these people know what's coming? No. Do we know what's coming? No. Will God's people be protected? Yes. Has God already decided what will happen according to his plan over the next 5, 10, 100 years until Jesus comes again? Yes. What's our role? What's our purpose? Well, we're here this morning, I hope, because we need a better understanding of his word so we can understand his will better, so that when the moment comes to you, and you need that moment of courage, because trust me, Esther had to take that moment of courage knowing she could be strucken down and killed later on when she approached the king without proper authority. She stood up and did it because God asked her to. There's our courage. It's already been done. Here's the example. When's our moment going to be? None of us knows. Who's it going to be with? We don't know. Will we influence somebody else? Will we have the ear of kings like Daniel or Esther? I don't know. But we need to prepare ourselves. And we need to always remember as God's people that in faith, we will help the kingdom move forward. God does not need us. And God can throw us aside if we're not the ones who choose to stand up in that moment. But his will still be done. Why would we want to be on the losing side? Let's choose today, and let's choose every day going forward. God, I'll be your man. God, I'll be your woman. Please help me know what to say and what to do when that moment comes. Whether small or large, we need to start moving the world towards God instead of continually allowing Satan to pull the world away from God. Any thoughts or comments as we close up this morning?